Hi everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today we are going to play around with a few different speckling techniques. I have mixed dry acid dye powder with citric acid in the past, and this is great for giving you sharp speckles that are easier to spread out. But there's some situations where you might not want to use citric acid, or you might not have citric acid powder on hand. So today, in addition to taking a look at citric acid powder, we're also going to look at speckling with table salt and with sugar. We have a special birthday shout out for today's episode of Dyepot Weekly. Happy birthday, Flora and Els! Today we are going to take a purely qualitative, well, I suppose it would be qualitative no matter what, but we're going to evaluate how these work for speckling by looking at the dyes low immersion in a pan at the same time. The two yarn bases we are going to dye today are Knit Picks Hawthorne Fingering Weight Yarn, which is 80% superwash Peruvian Highland wool, 20% polyamide, and then Knit Picks Swish DK, which is 100% superwash merino. Superwash yarns are ideal for speckling because colors tend to strike to them faster than their non-superwash counterparts. And I decided to look at two different bases to give us a good evaluation of these three different powders. I have added some reusable nylon zip ties onto the yarn to make it easy to flip, and we are going to pre-soak the 200 grams of yarn in just some plain tap water at room temperature for 30 minutes. In my catering steam pan that is 4 inches deep, I just added 4 cups of water, and I'm going to add 4 tablespoons of white vinegar. I gently squeezed out a lot of the water from the pre-soak, and now we are going to add our yarn. I've yet added the yarn on its side, so that way the circle would sort of face the side of the pan, versus laying it so you can kind of see like the O shape out in the pan. This way I can try to spread out the side as much as possible to get balance. At 4 cups we are at really low immersion, which would actually be pretty perfect for doing some speckling, but I do want to add more water because I want to be able to see how quickly things strike. So I'm going to bring the total volume up to 6 cups. Some yarn is a little bit below the surface, some is above the surface of the water, but this also gives us a little bit of wiggle room for evaporation. For the sharpest speckles, whatever technique, go with the lower volume of water, but I'm happy with this one. Since we are using commercial acid dyes, everything that I'm using today are dedicated dye equipment that isn't used for food. I have 6 cups set up here, 2 for citric acid, 2 for salt, and 2 for sugar. The salt that I used is non-iodized. I put 1 tablespoon of powder into each cup, and I labeled them so that way I will be able to keep track of which one is which. Whenever I am dealing with dye powder, I will be wearing a respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves. The 2 colors we are going to play with today are Dharma True Black, which does not break when speckling, and Dharma Bright Aqua. I wanted to pick both a deep saturated color and a non-pigmented color just for comparison. And I'm adding a 1/4 teaspoon of the dry dye powder to each of the cups. Normally, you know, I prefer to measure dyes by weight than by volume, but for something like this, I want to have like a consistency, and I think that it should be fine. I'm not planning on using all of this dye in this project. Now I'm going to stir everything up using a separate spoon for each color. That way I don't add any salt to the sugar container and vice versa. While stirring, I'm trying to make sure that there are no clumps, both in the dye itself but also the powder. What's this one? The salt feels super gritty. So we have our citric acid, our salt, and our sugar. The citric acid and sugar look pretty similar, but the salt is a little different. If you look at, gosh, it's hard to see, but if I tilt it, the pigment in here is going towards the bottom of the salt. It's not really sticking or coating the powder very much. So if I tilt it, you know, you can see some powder in there. It should still work. It's just we don't have a similar, quote, concentration in the salt. Why do this experiment at all? And the main reason why I want to look at this is that there are some cases where you don't want to use citric acid powder. Stellina, that beautiful silvery metallic shimmer that you can find in yarn, is pH sensitive. And it's a lot easier to make a condition too acidic when you're using citric acid versus vinegar. So a lot of people recommend only using vinegar when you want to speckle a yarn with stellina. So this is one situation where maybe you want to use something else to dilute your dye for speckling. And so that is sort of what influenced my decision to try this experiment. Let's start with the citric acid, since that's the one I know and love. And I'm just taking a little bit and I'm lightly dusting it, barely moving my fingers over the yarn. And this was obviously the black color. Right away you can see our really, really sharp and beautiful speckles. Next, let's try the sugar, since that one looked the most similar to the citric acid. And again, it's going to be hard to know how light or heavy I am going with this because the powders are different and I am using my hands. It looks like I did go heavier, and the speckles are looking nice. They're looking fairly sharp. They're a bit denser than what I did with the citric acid, but that could have been my delivery as well. Now let's look at the salt, which is a lot harder to mix and get consistent. But we are going to go for it just the same. So I think I added a lot more powder on with this than I did with the citric acid. Yeah, so it's a little hard to say, but it does look like some of those specks might be streakier. It's a little hard to know. I want to give it a tiny bit of time. Coming in for a closer look, here are our sugar speckles, our citric acid speckles, and then our salt speckles. Even though the salt is a bit heavier overall with the amount of dye that went on, it does feel to be a little bit streakier. The specks themselves feel larger, especially if we're looking over here at the Swish DK. I want to give this a little bit of time before we add the other color, but I would say that on first glance, my favorite speckles are with the citric acid, and then the sugar, and following the salt. I feel like my technique with the salt wasn't as good in the way that I sort of was speckling, but so I wouldn't worry about the like consistency that you see between the three. I'm used to dealing with the citric acid powder, so I'm a little better at it. It does look like there is a little bit more spread here with the sugar. So we're seeing more of a gray background, but there's also a tiny bit more dye. So that's a little hard to say for sure. Anyway, I am gonna let this sit for 10 minutes, then we can come back and we'll try the next color. If I wasn't doing this experiment, I probably wouldn't have waited so long between the colors. But let's take a look at our Bright Aqua. Once again, I am going to start with the citric acid, and I am just trying to keep my amount of powder pretty low. So this color is definitely lighter than the last one. But ooh, that's really pretty. I am washing my hands in between each color. That way I'm trying to get as good look at this as I can. Next, let's try the sugar. The crystal size feels really different in my hand, so it's something that I'm definitely going to need to like play around with and get used to. But I don't mind it. Finally, I'm coming in with the salt. Let's see. I'm pulling from the top. I'm not sure if there's even any. Yeah, there's barely any color because it's all sort of like gone down. You can see the gradient there. It's all sort of gone to the bottom. I think as a consistency issue, that's one reason to not use table salt on its own. Just because, like, if it would be nice if when you got powder you knew you were going to have a similar payoff each time. And because I feel like I butchered that first citric acid a little bit, I'm going to do it again. Get my gloves up. I think I just pulled a bit too much on that first one. I still did that too. I didn't really just want to take a little bit. So this is a color that definitely spreads out more overall. I set a timer for 5 minutes to wait, but here are our sugar speckles. Here are the citric acid speckles, and you can see we do have some nice sharp blue specks along with the black ones. And use some sharp specks with the sugar as well. And then here are the salt. The specks with the blue, there are some sharp ones, but I feel like it's a lot more spread overall. And then finally our last citric acid blue up there. The 5 minutes are up, and I have to say I think that my favorite is the citric acid, but it's also my favorite because it's what I'm the most used to. After the citric acid, I like the sugar. The speckles that we got on the sugar are way sharper than what we see with the salt. There's still some speckles in there, but I think the fact that the dye doesn't stay mixed in with the salt very well is sort of a reason to not want to use salt. I think with the other powders, the dye is sort of sticking to it somewhat, if that makes sense. And with the salt, the smaller dye powder just isn't sticking or coating it in whatever way. It's certainly not binding. But, you know, my gut says that the sugar would be the way to go if you don't want to use citric acid. So here we have our sugar speckles, and then over here we have our citric acid speckles. And I think with the sugar, I would just need to get a better handle on how much to add, but the speckles are pretty sharp. There's some areas where they're not quite as sharp, but I see dots, I see specks. Looking at just the blues from, say, the citric acid to the salt, there is a difference. There's definitely some speckles here in the salt. There's no question there's some speckles, but overall, things are more spread out. Overall, all of these differences are really, really subtle. You definitely could use any of them. And I'd love to hear what your preferences are in the comments down below. I know that citric acid is great because in addition to sort of enabling you to dilute the dye a bit, it also is giving you that added punch of being acid. So that could also help the color strike faster. Now, the total amount of citric acid powder that we used is not even like a reasonable fraction of the dye powder that I had mixed up today. So we could also sort of argue that the total amount of citric acid that we would be adding wouldn't be enough to say dull stellina. But that is an experiment that I am going to need to do at some point. Now we're going to flip this over and add some yarn to the other side. This is sort of in a, I'm not going to go wild, I'm not going to go crazy. This is sort of a non-specific kind of way, but I think that it'll still ultimately be fun. The pan is definitely warm, but I am able to sort of quickly and carefully have my fingers in there. Okay. And you can see that we've still got a fine water level. Our heat is still on low. And I am going to speed things up and apply some speckles in sort of a similar alternating pattern to this side. This time I'm not going to worry about the powder. I'll use some combination of them, but I think that it'll turn out beautiful. I know that my ability to differentiate between the colors that are from which powder once this yarn is dry are pretty slim. And so that's the other reason why I'm being non-specific on the other side. Can you guess which powder type I used on this side? I used only one type over here. I'm now going to wait 10 minutes to give everything time to dissolve and set, and then we will come back and see if there's any areas where we would like to add some more color. Are you ready? Sugar! I used sugar for this whole side, and I'm really happy with the way that a lot of these speckles turned out. One other thing I probably should have noted earlier, but my burners are located here and here. So when I was speckling with the citric acid, that was actually in one of the coolest parts of the pan. Just something else to consider. But now let's take this and see. Yeah, we've got great color on sort of the outside of our skein, but if I sort of rotate it, actually that's coverage is it's better than I thought. There's just sort of this one region where we didn't get as much color penetration. And I would like to add some more. We're probably going to be messing up my somewhat alternating black and blue colors. Let's look at the Swish Decay. Since that we're getting speckles and not a lot of spread, yeah. Okay, let's do, this time I'm laying it out more like the O, trying to spread it as much as possible. And I'm trying to have things like roughly aligned. There we go. So that way I can try to have like the blacks and blues semi-alternating. It's not going to be perfect, but all right, let's do, I'm going to go ahead and do this round off camera, and then I'll come in. That salt just won't get mixed up. 10 minutes later, and let's take one final look at the yarn. Yeah, because what I'm looking for is when I lift and move it is I want to see that there is color coverage. I don't want to see a lot of like bare white sections. Some white is totally fine, but I want to see nice coverage. And since I was doing such a light application with this dye, if I was going a lot heavier, we would have seen some of that color penetrate more through the yarn. But we're getting more shallow coverage, and I'm really happy with this yarn, and our dye bath is clear. I'm now going to turn off the heat entirely, and I am going to set the yarn aside so that way it can cool completely and then we can wash it. Let's start washing our beautiful speckled yarn. Now, I'm not expecting there to be any bleeding. I think that this yarn is in great shape. However, we are going to need to do a ton of rinsing because of the sugar. You don't want to leave the sugar in the yarn, but it should rinse out really easy. It's not like we use candy or something. And I'm now going to add a little bit of some clear dish soap just to help, and I'm using cool tap water. One of the main downfalls of the sugar is just that you have to make sure that you wash all the sugar out. And unfortunately, that requires a fair amount of rinsing. We want to make sure that we've rinsed all that out. And the best way to do that is with a series of rinsing. But once we're done rinsing, we will go and put this and put it through our new spring dryer and then hang up the yarn to dry, and we'll come back with some conclusions. Here is the finished dry yarn, and it really is quite lovely. There are beautiful sharp speckles of both the black and the blue all over the yarn, and I know I went down to just one kind of powder in the end, but I am still really thrilled with how this turned out. When it comes to playing with salt, citric acid, and sugar powders for dyeing yarn, all of them will work to help you spread out your speckles. I think that both of the fiber types also took up color beautifully. I am really glad that I played around with this using two different colors. One that I knew can give sharp speckles, and another one that is a bit more pastel, because I thought that it would give us another level of comparison when playing around with these powders. Now, if I were to rank these powders, clearly citric acid is our winner. After that, sugar is pretty decent, followed by the salt. And really, the salt was just not perfect because the powder did not really coat it. The acid dye powder didn't really coat that salt. And so when you grabbed a pinch of the salt, you didn't always get a good pinch of color. And so that inconsistency made it one of my least favorites. I still hope to give speckling with some citric acid powder on a stellina-based yarn a shot sometime in the future. That was one of the big reasons for taking a look at these different powders. Normally, there really isn't any reason to avoid citric acid unless you just can't find it. And then sugar is a reasonable substitute. You might have to rinse a little more, but it works. I would like to give one more huge happy birthday to our sponsors, Flora and Els. Thank you so much for sponsoring this and one other video. I have had a blast dyeing this yarn and filming this project with you guys in mind. If you would like to learn more about how you as an individual viewer can sponsor an episode of Dyepot Weekly, the link to my Etsy listing will be in the video description and iCard. The ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop is also filled with over 100 skeins of hand-dyed yarn featured in past and upcoming videos. So if sponsorship isn't really your thing, you don't really want to shout out in a video, you can go and pick from many other yarns that have been featured in my videos. If you don't need more yarn, which, you know, I can understand that feeling, there is also some ChemKnits merch. I have tote bags in my Etsy shop and some mugs and diaries over on Zazzle. And links to that is in the video description for all my videos, so you can find that there. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and thank you so much for watching this experiment. I know I learned a lot, and I hope that you all did too. Thank you so much for watching, everyone.